fearless leader, stay out of trouble.
Yeah.
All right. Ellen Bauer is the Public Health Division Director of the Sonoma County Department of Health Services. Prior to this assignment, she was the founding manager of Health Action, a coalition of diverse community leaders convened by the Health Department to identify priority health issues in Sonoma County and to offer leadership to implement initiatives and policies to create a healthier community. Before Sonoma County, Dr. Bauer had over 20 years of experience designing and implementing national and community health program evaluations. This includes sales of sodas in schools, asthma, long-term care services, and insurance, implementation of important outcomes, quality, utilization, and cost of managed Medicaid for both acute and long-term care services. She earned a BA in economics from Stanford, Master's of Public Policy, Graduate School of Public Policy, University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD Health Services and Policy Analysis, Berkeley. She was also awarded several pre- and postdoctoral fellowships from the National Institute on Aging and the Agency for Healthcare Policy and Research. She's a mother of 3 children and wife of a fantastic husband.
So let's all welcome Ellen. How do you do on speaker? How do you do? Is there anything that we can do for you? Thanks for coming here today. We are with you all the way. How do you do on speaker? How do you do?
Thank you. So I guess I just said, I have to click too. Well, while you're getting that going, I asked Brian, I said, is there any advice? Tell me about what is Rotary like? You know, what should I do? What should I not do? And he said, just don't stay too long on any one slide. So I don't think I really have a choice because I've got 25 slides in less than 20 minutes, so I'm going to sort of rush through this. The Department of Health Services is broken into 2 divisions. I'm the Director of Public Health, and I think Dr. Michael Kozart came and talked to you a little bit about behavioral health, but Brian did suggest that I at least give you a sense of my division, that it includes environmental health, disease control, public health lab, public health preparedness, emergency medical services, vital statistics. We have animal services, came to us from the Ag Commissioner in 2010, and family health. We have a number of services and programs for vulnerable families and children, our maternal and child health program, and then a healthy communities section that does a lot of prevention work. But today I wanted to talk about adverse childhood experiences. And Sonoma County was one of 14 communities across the nation that got an award, a grant called Mobilizing Action for Resilient Communities. And it was all around increasing awareness of the impact of adverse childhood experiences on lifelong health and social outcomes. As part of that, we had Dr. Robert Anda come a year ago and train a cohort of community educators about the science, and it's relatively new science around toxic stress and the impacts of adverse childhood experiences. So I was one of the community members that got trained. I don't consider myself an expert, but I'm very impressed, and the public health leaders in this nation really are seeing this body of science as the public health discovery of our generation. So what I'm going to do is sort of whip through the science. There's 4 neuroscience slides. Are there any experts in neuroscience here? Marty. Okay, so if there's any questions, we'll direct them at Marty. And then I'll go into the ACE study that came out of CDC and Kaiser, San Diego, and then we'll just wrap up with some information on resilience. So, very helpful. Yeah, it's going to be hard with only 2 hands. Okay, so this is Dr. Rob and Dr. Vince Folletti. They're the authors of the ACE study. It was the largest study of its kind, 17,000 participants, I mentioned, run by Kaiser in San Diego and the Center for Disease Control. Dr. Anda and his colleague from Harvard, Dr. Anda, approved all of the ACEs information in this presentation, and then Dr. Martin Teicher from Harvard approved the neurobiology information that I'm going to run through briefly. So here's the human nervous system. And, we basically have a brain, a spinal cord, and all the peripheral nerves that integrate all of our senses. And so basically it's in a very effective, efficient system. Our bodies pick up information constantly and instantaneously bring those senses into our bodies. This slide shows how our neurons develop at birth. We have very few. On the left, you see we just have basically what we need to eat and to go to the bathroom. By the time we hit kindergarten, depending on our experiences, those neurons have been developed. And so what gets experienced most tends to lead to more robust connections. That's called arborization. Then by the time you hit puberty, things get pruned away. So it's basically the things that are less experienced don't get developed. And so this is where the neuroscientists have showed us that when you have experienced neglect, those connections just wither away. So that's why it's so important that our little babies get those loving experiences so that those connections will stay strong. So this is sort of an illustration it's a very simple illustration of what happens for a child that is living in a dangerous environment. And it's perfect timing with this topic of domestic violence. So basically our bodies are hardwired to survive. We're going to survive no matter what. If you're a child that's living in a very dangerous situation where you don't know what's going to happen when you walk in the door, or even if you have a situation where you have a depressed mother and you're not getting any responses, that danger is going to create elevated levels of cortisol in your body forever. And our body, like on and on and on all throughout the day, and our bodies are really only designed to have that level of stress for 20 minutes at a time, that fight or flight. But what happens is that over time, your body is wired for that survival. On the bottom, in the blue, you see sort of the trajectory of a child that is in a safe environment. They're more able to observe, see things, wonder, interact, and prepare for survival in that scenario. So the bottom line of the message of this slide is that basically we do what we need to do to survive, and our bodies adapt appropriately. And if you're a child that is living in danger, you're always going to be looking around to what could be happening next versus being curious and wondering and reaching out for opportunities. So Dr. Teicher, the Harvard neuroscientist, basically says that's fine, but when our biology we collides with social expectations, that's when we run into trouble. So when you have a kid that doesn't know how to sit still, but then is arriving at school and told to sit still, but they're not feeling safe and comfortable and they're looking around, and then it sort of starts down that path of possibly discipline or being labeled as a bad kid. So those were my neuroscience slides, and what has happened is that the neuroscience and the epigenetics and what we know now about what happens inside the body has been mixed with the epidemiology. And this is a study of populations. What's happened is the scientists have come together and said, now we have some plausibility. We know what's happening inside the body from looking at data of large populations. We see what happens over time. And now there's enough plausibility there to suggest cause and effect. So the ACE study I mentioned happened in the 90s down in San Diego. They did a survey of 17,000 people. Oh, actually before that, I have to show you this is the hypothesis that they had. Prior to this study, most of the public health researchers would start at the what color is it for you guys? Sort of that health and risk, the third level down. And we used to say, what happens if you're smoking, for example? Okay, that leads to cancer and that leads to death. This study said there must be something going on, and it was sort of like, let's look at what happens underneath the waterline. Imagine that an iceberg. That these risks are not random, they're concentrated in some populations. And so they hypothesized that these early childhood experiences would then lead to changes in how people develop their social, emotional, cognitive functioning that would then lead to the risk behaviors, the diseases, and then the early death. So this slide is just sort of a filler slide for while we go back to the ACEs study. I'm not sure if this is San Diego or Atlanta. It sort of looks like it might be around Portland Plaza, but there were 17,000 adults in Kaiser in San Diego. They completed a survey about their childhood experiences and then also their health behaviors, disease risks, their experience with mental health, substance abuse, and then other health and social problems. They age range from 19 to 94 years, generally well educated, so these are all Kaiser members, predominantly white, middle class. So this is what they found. These adverse experiences are common. There's 3 groupings. On the left, you see household dysfunction, then there's neglect and abuse. So their basic findings is that they're very common. You can see substance abuse, 27%, parental separation or divorce, 23%. On the abuse side, physical abuse, 28%. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but the main findings is that they're common. And keep in mind that this is a middle-class, well-educated population. So what they did is just came up with a simple score. They said if you had any experience of abuse, no matter if it was every day or once, you would get a 1. If you had some kind of physical abuse and then maybe a substance abusing parent, you would get a 2. They wanted to just look for sort of a simple measure of biological stress response. If you're a child that had a lot of these different things going on, you would have a high score. If you had none, you would have 0. So they found that 33% of that population had none, and 16% had 4 or more. So they're common, and they also tend to cluster. In Sonoma County, we have about 21%, 21.6% that report 4 or more ACEs. It's not statistically significant from the state of California, but it's something that we're starting to look at more closely, and we definitely want to track over time.
Did you say 21%?
21.6 for Sonoma County.
Experiences 4 or more?
4 or more adverse childhood experiences, yeah. And the current state, I mean, that was Kaiser in the 90s, but the current state is around 16 also, but because the confidence intervals are so wide, the sample sizes aren't that large. It's from a national survey that has just small samples in each of the counties. It's really hard to zero in on it, but that is something we want to do a better job at, and to actually find out which of the components are more potent here. I think substance abuse and mental illness are big issues in Sonoma County. We know that they were included in this study. That the ACE study picked 10 items that they thought could relate to toxic stress in young people, but there's nothing magic about those 10. We know that there have been some clinics locally that are collecting data, and they've modified it a little bit. And so, for instance, they've added deportation as one of the stressors. Yeah. So not having a parent in the household, having a parent who's deported is something that we're looking at. So this just shows, and I'm going to show you a bunch of slides, and I don't have a whole lot of time, that show different conditions, but they did look at sort of a dose response. So in these slides, you'll see sort of a light blue on the left. You don't have any of these. And then as you get to more adverse experiences, you do see this dose response relationship. This is for smoking, early smoking initiation. So on the left, you see smoking by age 12, then current smoking as an adult, and then ultimately getting the disease, which here is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So you see that sort of stepwise increase. And it makes sense. I think it's something that's important for us as prevention people. We're trying to tell everyone not to smoke, not to smoke, not to smoke. But why is it that some people, even though they know it's not good for you, still do? And so having an awareness of sort of the underlying issues of what a person is trying to do to survive, I think will help us in our prevention strategies. And in fact, right now we are supporting the health centers with motivational interview training just for smoking cessation. It's an approach that is more sensitive to the needs of the people that are trying to quit smoking. Here we see liver disease, again, sort of that stepwise increasing dose response. Here, again, this is from the ACE study, but you see risk of becoming an alcoholic and then actually marrying an alcoholic. And so this sort of lends more data to our knowledge and our concern about how this might get passed through from one generation to the next. And just a few more here. This shows depression. So here we have women in the light blue. Women have report depression more than men, whether or not they actually are more depressed or whether they're more likely to report it. But again, for both men and women, you see that stepwise was increasing. So for a woman that has no ACEs, less than 20% to almost 60% for 4 or more. And depression is a leading cause of disability in the United States. So, think about what we could do if we could prevent that. And here's one of the strongest associations here with risk of suicide. Almost 20 times the amount of the risk. They also did an analysis looking at 18 different health and social problems. And again, I'm just going to not talk about all of these, but there's a whole long list. And again, they see that stepwise increase. These are some of the examples of problems that are attributed to ACEs. The CDC has a really good website, Center for Disease Control, where you can get the peer-reviewed literature and studies on all of these. Let's see. So for me, and we talked about the issue of domestic violence, and we know that these things are going to have so much impact. And I wonder, the call to all of us is, what are we going to do with this? How do we change the way we act in our community, in our families, in our jobs? And I do wonder, maybe the first 1,000 days is something that will become the new polio once polio is eradicated. And I'm so thrilled to know that Rotary is taking a stand on domestic violence, because that's certainly one of the most toxic stressors for our children. So similarly, when you think about the adaptations that our bodies make and the health impacts, we can see the pathways to poverty and homelessness as well. In the little circles there, it just sort of reminds us of what we saw in the earlier slides around as our bodies adapt. Maybe we don't have the language or cognitive development that we should have when we're babies. What happens to that as we start in school? Maybe we have failure, maybe we're coping with substances, maybe we have disciplinary issues at school, get kicked out, and then what's the trajectory? So as we think about issues of homelessness that we're definitely facing in this community, what organizations and communities who have become more trauma-informed have done is they start to think, well, what happened? And they're asking, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you? So to wrap up, they found that ACEs are common. They're very interrelated. If you have a risk of one, you have a risk of many, and that they are transmitted across generations. This slide really is important for me because it shows a pie chart with many health problems that in my department we're trying to tackle all of these, and often we're trying to tackle them in silos. Okay, I have funding to deal with tobacco use or asthma or alcohol abuse or depression or whatnot, and this shows the oil blob in the middle shows the percent of that problem that you could avoid if you just prevented childhood adversity. So it makes me think that, if we could just even weave in a portion of our work to prevent toxic stress, to think about early childhood development and support healthy development, we might be able to reduce all these problems simultaneously. And in fact, there are communities that have done just that by being more trauma-informed and by sharing information about adverse childhood experiences, that we become more sensitive and effective in everything we do in our schools, in our homes, in our workplaces. So, plant that seed. This, I can see I'm out of time. This slide basically is talking about resilience. There's a large resilience literature that says that, basically this isn't a death sentence, and that through building individual capabilities, through relationships and attachment, and through what you all are doing with Rotary, this community that wraps itself around, each other and supports each other, that we actually can do something about this. And let's see. So I guess the bottom line for me is I do think this is the public health discovery of our generation. I hope if any of you are interested in learning more that you'll reach out to me. This presentation really should go for about 45 minutes to an hour. We have a cadre of 58 other folks that have been trained. I have a lot more information we could share. And tomorrow night, I have actually a really great handout that you can take that has more information, and this was, actually it's over the table there by Brian. And then tomorrow night, there is a town hall on toxic stress, preventing toxic stress at the Glazer Center, and there's a number of policymakers and local leaders who are working on this. So I have flyers on this too if you're interested, and I guess there's no time for questions, or is there? Yeah, we have a few. Yeah. Okay.
What can we do?
Well, like I said, what I do, what I've thought about for myself is in my own family, in my neighborhood, on my driveway, when I see people who I think are angry, it makes me think, well, what happened to them? What happened to him? And I personally have more compassion, I think, in all of my relationships. I think we need to pay attention to the first 1,000 days. We need to understand that pregnant women have our next, neighbor growing in their stomachs, and what can we do to make sure that we reduce stress for young families as much as possible. So there are a lot of things you can do, and I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. But if you're an employer, you can think about parental bonding time. Does the parent have time to take off, to have time with their family? If you're a school administrator, you could think about, a lot of the schools in Sonoma County have moved away from zero tolerance, and they've shifted the way they support children and have that question, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you. So there's a whole shift that I think needs to happen across the board.
You spoke of communities that are implementing this. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, up in Washington, the Family Policy Council shifted their theory of change and how they supported a lot of these groups that were working in the community. They put ACEs awareness at the center, and they started spreading this information and basically, realized that if you've experienced trauma, participating in community life may be very difficult. And so through having greater awareness, there became a lot more acceptance. People were invited to the table. A lot of folks that had experienced trauma all of a sudden said, wow, I don't have to accept that this is a jail sentence. I can change my life. And so I think it just sort of cracked open. It allowed everyone to be involved and allowed people to change their culture of accepting the status quo. Things don't have to be this way. So there are examples of communities that have that oil slick I showed you. They brought down all of those indicators simultaneously by spreading the awareness of this. Yeah, Judy.
Has there been any conclusion or any correlation established between the age of the child when the onset of these experiences happened and the effect it wound up having on their adult life?
Yeah, there are a lot more detail around specific windows and even for specific genders. Like if a boy has sexual abuse at a certain age, then this is more likely. So there is a lot more detail that I don't even know. I mean, I could look it up. It's in some of the training materials. But the most critical window is that first 1,000 days when the basic architecture of the brain is being established. But then beyond that, the specific type of abuse, the specific age window, and the gender, you see different things happening. Marty?
One of the things I found,
Just a second.
one of the things I found is that part of the issue with this issue is a lot of these children, I believe, are adopted children. That is one area that we need more support to help these children that are adopted. You know, I have the resources that I could help my child that we adopted at age 5, okay, who had issues. But there are a lot of these kids that you're going to see in these things that are in the system, in the foster adopt system, that are going to have extreme issues of what you're talking about, and that's why they're going to be in foster homes.
Yes, so the research has shown, you know, when you think about the Romanian orphanages, you know, that's that extreme neglect that, you know, brains just don't develop, and there's this whole spectrum. But for those that, so that's, yes, we want to prevent that. We want to have the nurturing connections develop. But for those that maybe didn't have that, and there's so much that we can do to support them. And in fact, in San Diego, they found, even just by asking the question, what happened, they didn't even do a health intervention, but for many people, no one had ever asked. And a lot of this research came out of obesity clinics where they were just saying, why the heck, what is going on? Why, you know, people would start losing weight and then they would gain it back because that was a safety mechanism. But just being asked, you know, being obese was a way to protect from, maybe they'd had been sexually abused or whatever. But even just asking the question of what happened to you, it's healing in and of itself.
I know we're near the end of our
Second.
time,
Yeah.
but I'm wondering if there are, in these studies, whether there were any controls for organic neurological deficits in the children and people that were studied.
Yeah, I'm not a neuroscientist, but there's like this whole booming literature on that, so I can't answer that question, but I know the CDC website has a bunch of information on the ASA study, and
I'm specifically talking about people on the spectrum.
yeah, that's not my area of expertise. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that great presentation and that information. It ties in really well with this effort we're going through for the month of October for domestic violence. Probably 95% of the folks who are abusers were at one time abused or suffered those issues themselves. So it's so important to get it done at the Ellen, I do have one last task for you. We have a drawing, and we have a chunk of money here to give away. And what you need to do is draw one of the tickets, and then somebody will kick a card.
5, 1, 8, 8, 6, 5, 8.
Good clubs, good clubs, good clubs.
Poor get richer.
Thank you, Alan.
Oh my goodness. I could use that.
Yeah. Okay.
Two.
So close.
Thanks for playing.
Thank you.
And the line was provided by, I don't have my slide. Thank you, Debbie. Marty, thank Debbie.
Thank Debbie.
Thank Debbie.
Thank you, Debbie.
All right, Joe, would you like to lead us out?
Joe!
Joe! Oh! I don't have my slides up. Joke of the day, who's got the joke? Yes.
I need a mic. Mike. I'm not good at telling jokes, so what I did was I went around to club members.
Whisper the joke then.
Marty, I went around to club members and asked them for a punny remark.
Honey?
Punny. So from Vicky, I used to be a banker, but I lost interest. From Brian, I changed my iPod's name to Titanic. It's sinking now.
Joe says,
No, stop it. Joe says, I know a guy who's addicted to brake fluid, but he says he can stop at any time. Linda, She's reading a book about anti-gravity. She just can't put it down. Scott, you didn't like his beard at first, then it grew on him. And for all of us, don't worry about old age. It doesn't last.
Now, Joe.
Trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.